Only an airman would see the Western Front as it really was in the spring of 1915. At 600 feet, you could fly along the pockmarked front and twisted trenches, running straight, then twisting and turning this way and that, in an apparently haphazard and unnecessary curve. No man's land, much wider in places than you might have thought from the maps at headquarters.
No man's land was the area of land that was between both trenches on either side. That neutral territory was heavily fought over throughout the entire war. In many cases at night, where a lot of patrol action went on, soldiers would have to crawl out through no man's land to try to get into the enemy trenches, either for intelligence purposes or to capture a prisoner to get more information from them. The land itself was usually an open stretch of land between two huge belted areas of barbed wire that each army had in front of their own trenches. So it was hotly contested. Artillery played such a tremendous role that no man's land was a mess. Deep shell holes, lots of mud, hard to traverse, and to get a sizable army to come through when you're attacking.
By the spring of 1915, the front line system was made up of 3 parallel lines: the fire trench, the travel trench at 20 yards, then the support line, close enough to reinforce in case of a raid. All 3 lines were built in dogtooth shapes with bays 5 paces wide, separated by hiccups in the line, designed to minimize bomb blasts and prevent enfilade fire should the enemy raiding party get into the trench. The depth of the trenches was about 4 feet, with a built-up wall of sandbags as a parapet to allow men to stand upright. The power of the bullets they had to keep out is suggested by the official widths laid down for these parapets: 18 inches for loose-packed earth, 38 inches for oak, or 7 feet of turf. At the bottom of the trench ran a drainage tunnel leading to sumps and covered with lengths of wooden ladder called duckboards. Facing the enemy was a step, the fire step, which brought rifles tucked into the shoulder up to ground level. Ideally, wire or wooden plank reverting completed the structure by checking the constant tendency of the trench sides to collapse. But usually this attention to detail was found only on the German side of the line. The support line was rather more complex, since less risk allowed greater comfort. Kitchens, latrines, stores, and mortar positions were dug at the end of short lead-off trenches. Dugouts, above all, were the trademark of the support trenches. Often they were 15-foot shafts that led to caves about 5 paces square and 6 feet high. Shape would be kept with wooden beams and wire netting. One British officer commented that most were as well furnished as his rooms in Oxford. Just how safe they were was another matter. If the roof was an iron sheet and a foot of earth, the dugout was just shrapnel-proof. Only 8 feet of earth would deter a 6-inch shell. This reliance upon positional defense created quite unprecedented material demands. The French, for example, at the end of 1915, estimated that there were 20 miles of trench for each mile of the line. By August of the following year, the figure was thought to be half again as much. If this figure is accurate, it means that on the Allied side, on the entire Western Front, there were some 15,000 miles of trenches. An individual service in the trench system was relatively brief. Of the 20,000 soldiers in a division, only 2,000 were at the front at any moment. The Black Watch once served 48 days in the line unrelieved, but they were the exception. Few men fought for long periods.
Different armies acted differently. Some would rotate their troops out after so many weeks or so in the line. Also, casualties had a resulting effect on that. If they were particularly hard hit, they would pull a unit out and let them rest and refit and re-equip before they let them back in. Unlike now, where it's more scrutinized at the time, they weren't really aware of the psychological damage that were incurring on a lot of these soldiers for spending way too much time in the front. You know, they called it shell shock back then.
The interesting point here is that attacks and offensives were rare. In fact, they formed a very small portion of the soldiers' active service. While in the trenches, troops on both sides only saw the enemy very infrequently. In trench service, soldiers rarely found themselves in the same place more than 3 or 4 times. A British soldier in France for more than a few months could expect to serve in 3, 4, and 5 different sectors. Even in the same sector, he would be continually moving from trenches to billets, back to new trenches, and then to fresh billets. This is one of the few respects in which German trench routine was much different from the British. German regiments tended to remain much longer in one place. One German unit, on Vimy Ridge, the Bavarian 73rd Hanoverian Fusilier Regiment, had been there almost from the beginning of the war. For French, British, and Germans, the move to the front was much the same. The new company would take up its assigned position after at least one night in billets, which they had reached by a route marched from another part of the sector. These in themselves were grueling experiences, the troops often covering 15 or 20 miles. Only 10 minutes rest was allowed every hour, and in summer the exertion often proved too much. The men would move up to the front line at night because of the threat of hostile artillery. Most of the journey would be through the communication trenches, each platoon being separated by intervals of 100 yards. Again, deference to the enemy artillery. There was no light, and each man could only stumble along after the person in front of him, often through inches of mud or water. He would be only conscious of the dead weight of his load, often weighing 85 pounds, and the braces biting into his shoulders, of his thirst and the sweat of his body, and the longing to lie down and sleep. When the halt finally came, men would doze where they stood.
No man's land was very scary at night, and it was very hard to traverse, like I said. So it was the area where gains were measured in yards. If they could make 100 yards or 200 yards and lose 10,000 guys, that was considered acceptable, which in our standards now is absolutely absurd. Artillery was the main killer of everything, that and the machine gun.
As worn out and burdened as they were, the troops would stumble into their new position, and the replaced unit would hurriedly assemble and make their own laborious way back down the communication trench and support trench. Company headquarters were set up in a dugout, and the men allocated their various duties. Like everything else, the daily routine in a forward trench varied from unit to unit. Certain features, however, were standard. The most important of these was that at all times some portion of the men would be on sentry duty. The task was usually split into 2 or 3 hour watches. At night, the number of sentries usually doubled, leaving less time to sleep. Sheer exhaustion, in fact, was one of the greatest problems at the front. After dark, sentries had orders to stand with their head and shoulders above the parapet. It required greater vigilance and also put the top of the guard's head above the level of the trench. Enemy machine guns were trained on this level, and it would be safer to get hit in the chest or shoulders than in the forehead. The whole 24-hour cycle in the trenches revolved around Stand 2, just before dawn and dusk, where everyone mounted the fire step in case the enemy should choose this propitious moment to attack. The rest of the 24 hours was divided into 2 to 4 watches, those on duty being told to be particularly vigilant at night. After the dawn Stand to, there would normally be a tacit truce for an hour or so, as each side prepared and ate breakfast. After the morning meal, fatigue parties were assembled to repair the trenches, and other work was done. Lunch was at noon, followed by the dusk Stand to for about an hour, after which fatigue parties worked all night.
It was horrible. The weather was awful. There was a lot of rain. The food was not very good in either armies. The water was tough because in many cases, particularly in the British, they would wash out petrol tins and fill it up with water, so the water usually tasted like gasoline. I talked to an American doughboy veteran many years ago who told me that one of the staples that they got was canned salmon. And he got canned salmon 3 meals a day for months on end, and he had never eaten salmon after the war ended for the rest of his life. They would have corned beef, which they called corn willy. They had roast beef, which they called monkey meat. The salmon was called goldfish. They also had stewed tomatoes, which one guy told me that he always carried 2 cans in his pack because he could drink the juice. He knew it was safe to drink, and he could always get a quick meal out of it.
Particularly wearing were the endless fatigues. The trenches nearly always required some sort of repair or modification. Rations and stores had to be carried up from the trenches farther back, or wounded men had to be carried back to the medical officer's dugout. And almost every day and night, men would have to advance into no man's land to repair a gap in the wire or lay even more. Fatigues were just as endless in the support and reserve positions. In between the heavy lifting, water bailing, trench digging, and wire laying, the soldiers, eye deep in hell, were expected to fight in a brutal conflict without end. In the latter half of the war, all sides began to realize that the soldiers simply could not sustain the dual role as combat troops and porters. The word fatigue was replaced by working parties. Somewhat later, the British and the Germans began to form labor battalions to do the heavy trench digging and road repairs, while the French used territorial regiments.
It really was hell on earth for these guys, and we have no conception of how tough these guys became in order to survive. They had to survive day by day, and rebuilding revetments, the trench lines that had been hit by shells, going out on patrols at night, stringing barbed wire, going out and cutting the other guy's barbed wire, removing wounded when they could get them. It was a constant battle between the elements and the enemy and nature, as far as the vermin that was there on a regular basis for them.
As soon as the trench lines were dug, it became apparent that the existing ways of waging war were inadequate. Trenches had no flanks, and the defender had an almost insurmountable advantage. Calculations suggested that in 1915, a rifle-armed trench garrison with a clear field of fire would need to be assaulted by a force 12 times the defenders' numbers to ensure that the attacker would have a chance to reach the enemy line with enough strength left to take the position and hold it. The immediate consequence was a mad scramble to procure weapons and revise tactics which could deal with trenches or force the enemy to throw their best troops into the meat grinder to avoid losing the war.